So I forgot to get into, like I had said, the flip side of the Christian view and the Eastern view that I had put forth before about the radical acceptance of everything already being perfect as it already is. There's a flip side to that, which is everything sucks and is absolutely imperfect forever and always has been and always will be. There's an exact opposite view to the view of valuing everything and the view of making everything, not making, but of understanding that everything is already perfect. There's a flip side to that, which is the belief that everything is and always has been and always will be imperfect. And so the flip side, if God is the one that holds the view that everything has infinite value, then the devil would have to hold the position that everything has zero value, or perhaps even negative infinity value. But certainly no value in any positive sense. So if his way and his truth and his light is acceptance and toleration and love, then it would seem that the devil's philosophy would be a doctrine of hatred and intolerance and the compulsion to change everything. Which makes sense, because that's what Satan does. He accuses. That's what Satan means. It's the Hebrew way of saying accuser, one who has accused someone. You are evil. You are wrong. You suck. You did something wrong. You are an evil person. You are worthless. Blah, blah, blah. That's accusatory. That's evil. That's satanic. That has to deal with Satan. That's the opposite of what I believe God to be. And so the philosophy of nihilism is that. Now, there's two kinds of nihilism, because most people, when they hear nihilism, they think about apathy. They're like, well, a nihilist is somebody that just doesn't value anything, they don't care. But you have to understand, if you really do take the view that something has no value and yet it exists, there's a tension in that doesn't allow for apathy. Apathy is ignorance. It's, I don't care because I just never went there and don't know anything about it, don't want to know anything about it, fuck that, I don't care. So that's apathy, and that's not really nihilism. You might call it cousin or something to nihilism, but it's not actual nihilism. Nihilism, active nihilism, is a philosophy unto itself. It's very strange, and I've also experienced that. I have experienced the absolute hatred of everything in existence, including God and myself and heaven and everything and hell, everything, absolutely everything, because it wasn't nothing, and nothing at the time that I was going through this active nihilistic phase was the object of my worship. And I would always contrast and compare everything back to it, and it was my foundation of meaning, and it was my measure of meaning and value and context and what should be done about it and all that. I would use nothing, and the reason that I did that was for ontological reasons. I wasn't able to think of anything that would be beyond nothing in order to have been the original cause. And then later I found causal dynamism is the origin. It's not nothing. There's actually something that you could have that precedes even that. God, obviously, but then there's causal dynamism, which is the ability for something to, it doesn't have a linear cause anymore. It has no predecessor, which of course that's the origin, because you can't go any further back, because there's nothing further back than it. And so that kind of an answer to the question is sort of like saying, well, what happened before the Big Bang? Well, the question itself is meaningless because it presupposes a time before time, or something like that. So it's not a real answer, but it gets you closer. And then as you start to climb out of the hole of nihilism toward causal dynamism and toward God, then eventually you start to realize that everything must have a value, because even the valuing of things has value. Why? Because when I choose to devalue everything in existence, that itself has no value also. And this is the problem with nihilism. Nihilism is that it is inherently self-contradictory. Nothing, likewise, is self-contradictory. Nothing contradicts itself. Why? Because nothing is nothing contradicts itself. If you think about it, the phrase nothing is nothing, that means that there is not such a thing as nothing. Well, if there isn't such a thing as nothing, then there isn't anything there to be and is. There is nothing there to exist. And so even referring to it is ridiculous. But at the same time, nothing is nothing also means that which is, nothingness, that which is nothingness, is the only thing which can be nothingness. That there isn't anything else that could be that except itself. So both of those are valid, both of them are necessary, and yet both of them are mutually exclusive and contradict each other. So nothing is self-contradictory. And nihilism is self-contradictory, and nihilism is an actual philosophy. It's not the lack of philosophy. It is a philosophy, but it is its own antithesis. Nihilism is its own antithesis. It's its own critic. It's its own destroyer and creator. So nihilism is simply the philosophy which bases everything upon nothing. So that if I'm going to say, what is the value of whatever? Well, if I ascribe nothing infinite value, if I ascribe nothing any value, in fact, then everything else must have no value. So then if I use nothing as a foundation, then it must have value, because that's what's being used to determine other things' value, is their relation back to it. So if it has no value, then everything else has no value because of the relation between the two. And if it does have value, then everything has no value because of its relation back to itself. Being nothing makes it impossible to relate to anything else. So any relation back to nothing is self-contradictory or impossible, thus leading to no value for anything, including no value for nothing. So, God's view is the opposite of that. It is the infinite value of God, the infinite value of the relation between God and creation, the infinite value of creation, and the infinite value of everything in creation. Nihilism, the satanic view, is the devaluation of nothing, the devaluation of the relation between nothing and everything else, and the devaluation of everything that isn't nothing. And so then it's the devaluation of all things. So that means that the devil hates everything and God loves everything. God values everything, the devil doesn't value anything. These are, you start to develop a pretty concise view of who these personalities or what these positions are and how to use them to measure the context of anything. Because now it's not so much about what did God say or what did this book say. It's just deductive reasoning. It's like, if something contradicts itself, how can I value it? I don't know what the value of a self-contradiction would be. Because it's self-contradictory, I can't derive any value from it. if nothing contradicts itself and God does not contradict God's self, then I must value God. And so it seems to be this like absolute thing. It scared the shit out of me when I first started to realize this stuff, because I was like, oh God, that means that if I ever deviate, then I'm evil. If I ever have hatred in my heart, I will go to hell to the degree to which I held that hatred, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not really like that. It's not so meticulous. It's not so sharp. It's something that's more like, when God values everything, God even values the devaluation of things. So it's not that it's something that needs to be destroyed. It's something that destroys itself. And God understands that and accepts, and this is really difficult, he rejoices in everything, even in the self-destruction of something that's evil. But that's like it says in the Bible. That's why we don't judge, and that's why we don't have vengeance against anyone, because vengeance is the Lord's. God created everything, and when God created evil things, he created them to self-destruct. And it isn't that he made them like that, it's that that's the way it is, because if it were anything else, everything would be perfect arbitration and a perfect imposition of God's will. If that should sound familiar from the satanic view, that's not the way it is. There's an inherent logic in non-contradiction, in mutual cooperation, in understanding each other, versus saying, no, there's really no value in anything intrinsically. Nothing has any intrinsic value. And there's no way of evaluating anything. And everything is absurd and meaningless and pointless and just ridiculous, and it's accidental, and there's no meaning behind any of it. No one likes that view. It's soul-destroying. But when you believe that there is infinite value, I may not know what that is. I may not know how that's possible. I may not even want to accept that value, that there's infinite value in raping my own child to death and laughing while I do it and flipping off God while I do it, and God rejoices at this. It's a very strange philosophy. When you first are introduced to it, it can be a culture shock, and I went through a psychotic break because of this, and I hated existence, and I thought the very act of existence was a crime, and that God was insane, and everything was all fucked up. And that's probably, I would imagine and assume, where most people would be if they heard this for the first time, is like, what the fuck is this shit? But the reason that God rejoices is because none of what's happening at the time, as isolated from everything else, God is rejoicing in the fact that it got to exist. It at least got to exist. It may not have, that there's an intrinsic value to existence even in suffering. And what is that intrinsic value? Freedom. The one thing that nothingness doesn't have, where, a satanic person could say, yeah, but, if there weren't anything that existed, then there would be no child raping, and there would be no murder, and there'd be no rape, and there'd be no theft, and there'd be no sin. So it must be a sin to have created anything, and God should have just existed as God's self alone, and there shouldn't be anything else, or there should just be nothing, and nothing should exist, because it would be unjust for God to selfishly enjoy existence while nothing else ever could, because everything else is dependent upon God and imperfect and doomed to sin, etc. How can you find any purpose in that? How is that something worth rejoicing over? The intrinsic value of being able to not impose one's will, but to exercise it, and to observe and experience and be part of creation. And creation is always self-affirming. Destruction is always self-denying. And that's why Jesus says mercy, not sacrifice. So this whole notion of there being some value in the raping of a child is in the sense that the child now has the freedom to choose God despite this. And imagine how powerful that is. And then you can start to understand why God always rejoices at everything, all the time. Because in the face of pure, wretched evil, there is still the light of God. And it cannot ever be thwarted. So there.